Well, I sure hope you have rediscovered some of that Christmas wonder that you had as a child tonight. And I hope that the next thing will help you rediscover that a little bit more. What I'm about to tell you is one of my favorite Christmas stories. And you could say that it's a story from a previous life for me. Before I became a pastor, I made my living in radio broadcasting. I was a disc jockey, a radio announcer. Yes, I realize this may be difficult to believe, but it's true. And one of my favorite things that I used to do at one of the radio stations I worked at was every afternoon we would play a program that originated in Chicago. It became very well known, Paul Harvey's The Rest of the Story. Any Paul Harvey lovers here tonight? Love that guy. And every Christmas Eve, Paul Harvey would read something a little bit different than the rest of the stories he usually did. He would read something that he himself wrote. He called it The Parable of the Birds, and it went something like this. He'd say, "The man I'm going to introduce you to was not a Scrooge. He was kind, decent, a mostly good man, generous to his family, upright in his dealings with other men, but he just didn't believe all that incarnation stuff, which churches proclaim at Christmas time. It just didn't make sense, and he was too honest to pretend otherwise. He just couldn't believe God coming to earth as man. He didn't believe it would be impossible for a God, of course, but he couldn't understand the motive. Why would a God care to do that? I'm truly sorry to distress you," he told his wife, "but I'm not going to church with you this Christmas Eve." He'd said he'd feel like a hypocrite, that he'd much rather just stay at home. And so he stayed, and they went to the candlelight service. Shortly after the family drove away, a sudden storm started up. Snow began to fall, and the winds blew outside his window as he sat in his favorite fireside chair and read a book. A few minutes later, he was startled by a thudding sound, and then another, and then another. At first, he thought someone must be throwing snowballs against his window. But when he went to the window to investigate, he saw a flock of birds huddled miserably in the snow. They'd been caught in the storm and, in a desperate search for shelter, had tried to fly right through his large landscape window. Well, he couldn't very well let the poor creatures lie there and freeze, and then he remembered the barn. That, he thought, would provide a warm shelter. So quickly he opened the front door, put on a coat and boots, and tramped through the deepening snow out to the barn. He opened the doors wide and turned on a light, but the birds didn't come in. He figured food would entice them in, so he hurried back to the house, fetched breadcrumbs, and sprinkled them on the snow, making a trail to the yellow-lighted, wide-open doorway of the stable. But to his dismay, the birds ignored the breadcrumbs and continued to fly around helplessly in circles. He tried catching them. He tried shooing them into the barn by walking around them, waving his arms. Instead, they scattered in every direction, except into the warm, lighted barn. And then he realized they were afraid of him. To them, he reasoned, "I am a strange and terrifying creature. If only I could think of some way to let them know that they can trust me, that I'm not trying to hurt them, but to help them. But how? They just would not follow. If only I could be a bird," he thought to himself, "and mingle with them and speak their language. Then I could tell them not to be afraid. Then I could show them the way to safety, the way to the safe, warm barn. But I would have to be one of them so they could see and understand." At that moment, the church bell began to ring. The sound reached his ears above the sounds of the wind. And he stood there, listening to the bells, pealing the glad tidings of Christmas. And he sank to his knees in the snow. You know, I love that story because in many ways, well, it's my story. I came to a moment in my life when I believed that, as the scripture says, the Word, through whom all things were made, became flesh and dwelt for a while among us. You know, maybe tonight you can identify with those little lost birds in the story. Maybe you feel like you've been caught up in one of life's sudden storms. Maybe even tonight you feel a little scared, a little directionless. You feel lonely, maybe a little guilty or powerless. Well, the good news, the great news of Christmas is that it means that God, the God of the universe, came to be one of us so he could show us the way, so he could be the way, the truth, and the life. And if you'll listen, you'll hear him saying to you, follow me. Follow me to safety. Follow me to warmth. Follow me to light and love. Follow me to the stable. I hope you have come to that stable tonight to really understand that is why Jesus came.